Welcome to our fourth AIDEN webinar, Catalytic Impact-First Investing, nothing like fluffing the opening line. A discussion on blended capital for impact-first investments. Today is also the launch of the Good Return Impact Investment Fund. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands on which we work today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. So briefly about AIDEN, the Australian International Development Network. Today is our fourth public webinar. We also have 2 roundtable discussions scheduled for this month, further plans for December, and a busy program already in planning for 2021, the first year of the Biden presidency. My name is Mark Kubert, and I'm a passionate member of the AIDEN team, which is chaired by Simon Lewis and capably managed by Julie Rosenberg. Today, we have a record number of participants on the webinar, 120 plus, which proves that this group is growing. It's a huge number for this not so fledgling group, so large that as I scanned down the list, there were people I used to work for on it. There were people who were my past clients and people who are still waiting for a response to my emails from a week ago. Anyway, enough from me and over to the experts. Our facilitator today is Lillian Kline. Lillian operates right at the intersection of impact investing. By day, she is head of client engagement at Impact Investment Group. In her spare time, alongside many other roles, she heads the Impact Club, Australia's first and only impact investing network. Lillian, looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mark. And it's absolutely a delight to be here for a number of reasons. Melbourne, the sun has literally just come out in Melbourne. We are literally allowed to go further than our 5 kilometres. So, as I just chatted to Mark before, I had decided not to look at the news in the last hour, but I think we all know that hopes and prayers, as the Americans like to say, that it's going to go the way that most of us want it to. Thank you to Julie and AIDEN for inviting me to facilitate this, this wonderful conversation today about catalytic impact-first investing. I'm going to keep my speaking to a minimum because, as Mark said, I'm going to hand over very, very quickly to our experts. First, we're going to hear from Shane Nichols and the extraordinary fund that he's just about to launch with his organisation. And then we have a literally stellar group of panellists who I'll introduce in a moment. But we've got Gemma Salteri, Stephanie Kimber, Yannick Melev, all giving us their insights and wisdom on impact investing, philanthropy, and how we can all be committed to investing and contributing to solutions for greater impact. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Shane.
Thanks very much, Lillian. And before I get started introducing the Good Return Impact Investment Fund, I'm just going to ask our chair, the chair of Good Return, Kate Jordan, just to say some opening remarks. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Shane, and thanks, Lillian. On behalf of the board of Good Return and our partners, I can't tell you how delighted I am to officially launch our Impact Investment Fund. And thank you for your interest in this social impact opportunity. We all know that in response to COVID-19, the Australian government has provided billions of dollars of relief to small business owners and those at risk of losing their incomes. And that stimulus support assists millions of Australians to stay on their feet, pay for essentials like rent, food and bills. And indeed, I was reading a really interesting article in The Economist recently, and it was talking about the fact that in developed countries compared to developing countries, the stimulus packages in developing countries are about 1/10 of the stimulus packages using GDP percentages as a measure. And I think that really highlights this issue about, what's happening in developing countries in our Asia Pacific region, where small businesses actually do form the backbone of the economy, but they're unable to access the type of stimulus package that we have in Australia. And we know that small and medium-sized agribusiness will be the driver of economic recovery in rural areas. They'll be generating jobs, incomes, and food supply for vulnerable families. And a lack of investment at a time like this will have dire consequences that thrust families deeper into poverty for generations. And indeed, that same report in The Economist also spoke about the fact that there is a real risk that in developing countries across the world through this pandemic, up to 490 million people will be thrust back into a life of poverty. And that's where Good Returns Impact Investment Fund comes in. And I don't think there could be a more timely moment in our history to be launching a fund like that, because we're trying to address the finance gap by leveraging impact-orientated investments to facilitate lending to small businesses in developing countries. And this is a new type of catalytic investment that, as I said, it's never been so important. I hope you'll join us by investing in our Asia Pacific neighbours to help them emerge from this crisis with strong livelihoods and a sustainable future. And I can certainly say that this is a fund that my husband and I will be investing in as well. I'll now hand over to our CEO, Shane Nichols, who will provide an overview of the fund. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. Hi, everyone. Well, my backdrop here is the beautiful Solomon Islands, and I thought it would be an appropriate place from which to launch our fund, because this is where it all began for us, supporting rural villages, such as the one you can see in the background. They're surrounded by coconut trees, and our pilot investment under this impact investment model was to work with a local social enterprise to help them extract greater value from these coconuts, processing virgin coconut oil for export. I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, but I'll start by just providing a little bit of background on Good Return and why we established this impact investment fund. So Good Return is an international development agency that operates across the Asia Pacific region, and we enable women and their families to build pathways out of poverty. There are three core pillars to our work. The first is funding small business loans. The second is financial education to help people manage their money and their small businesses. And the third is working at a sector level to strengthen the provision of responsible finance. We've been operating in this space for about 18 years, and over that time, we've partnered with over 50 financial service providers from across the Asia Pacific region. Through them, we've worked with more than 4,000 of their staff, building capacity at a sector level, particularly in areas of responsible and inclusive finance. And again, through these partners, we've reached more than 50,000 vulnerable people through access to financial education and small business training, helping them to better manage their money and their small businesses. We have an online loan platform that has funded more than 11,000 microloans. 98% of those loans have gone to women, and we have almost 100% payback under that program. And it's really that experience in microfinance that led us to identify the funding gap for slightly larger businesses and establish our impact investment model. As I mentioned, we've piloted it in the Solomon Islands and in the Pacific and funded 6 SMEs through that program in order to validate the model. And now we're launching a fund in order to scale it up. Now, many of you will be aware that access to microloans, and that is loans of up to a few $1,000s, has increased dramatically across most of the region. But it's the slightly larger SMEs that might require $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 to expand and employ more people that still struggle to access finance, particularly in rural areas where poverty is concentrated. Often this is due to a lack of suitable collateral or banking history or not having well-documented business plans. These types of SME businesses are often agri-processors that might buy crops from farmers and provide a route to market for these vulnerable families. So we focus on SMEs that generate opportunities for them, in particular for women in the value chain. This group is what we refer to as the missing middle. And in this diagram, you'll see that in developed countries such as Australia, small businesses have much improved access to finance compared to developing countries, where microfinance is providing much greater access these days to micro businesses, and the bigger end of town are serviced by banks, but it's those small and medium-sized businesses that are missing out. Our Impact Investment Fund directly targets 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals, number 1, 5, 8, and 17. And starting with 17 first, the way that we've constructed this model is to do what we've always done, and that is to support local partners, local financial service providers, as the providers of finance in their communities. We look for local agencies that are well placed to serve these SMEs. This includes microfinance agencies that are looking to explore SME lending, and one of our panelists today, Yannick, is from a microfinance agency that we're working with in Cambodia. We also work with fintechs who are reaching out to rural areas with more innovative financing models, and we're exploring a partnership with a fintech in Indonesia. And we also work with smaller challenger banks that are exploring new markets, such as what we did in the Solomon Islands. And we help these lenders to build a portfolio of SME agri loans by taking some of the risk by offering a guarantee. We also link the SMEs to business planning assistance where they need it so that they can meet the lender's requirements. And we work with the lender themselves to apply a gender lens to their investments, intentionally exploring opportunities to support women's economic participation. The model that we use has 3 key elements. The first is a 20% risk capital pool. This bears any first losses. So if one of our partners experiences a loss in their portfolio and they make a claim on the guarantee, that loss will be absorbed by this risk capital pool. And this has been generously funded by DFAT. And we have a DFAT representative, Steph Kimber, who's joining us in our panel discussion today. The second pool is the investment pool. And the purpose of the first loss pool is really to de-risk and crowd in private sector funds into this second pool. That comprises 80% of our fund, or $800,000, taking our fund value to $1 million. Then we enter into pari passu, or 50% risk share guarantees with our partners. And what that means is that our $1 million that we've raised in our fund can leverage $2 million in funding by our local partners. Now, in terms of the investment capital, we've also got, joining our panel today, Gemma Saltieri from the Cages Foundation, who were the first investor in our pilot program and the first investor into our fund. So it'll be great to hear from Gemma. In terms of how the investment looks for an investor, the minimum investment size is $20,000. So we're targeting sophisticated investors here who are looking for genuine impact. And the period is 5 years with the potential to exit after 3 years. The target return is a cash deposit rate of return. And the reason for this is because the funds are held in an Australian bank and used to back guarantees to our offshore lenders. Any earnings off that Australian bank account are returned to investors, hence a cash deposit rate of return. We're also raising a pool of grant funds, and these will be used to support our partners, building their capacity in a number of areas. The first is in conducting a diagnostic in order to design SME loan products. The second is to apply a gender lens to their work using tools and frameworks that we can provide. And the third area is supporting SMEs with their business planning where that's required. There's no minimum grant size for the capacity building pool. And as we are a DGR1 entity, Good Return is able to offer full tax deductions on any funds donated. So I'll give you an example, just coming back to the Solomon Islands, of how this actually works in practice. So using a $50,000 investment from the Cages Foundation, we were able to approach a local bank in the Solomon Islands, Pan-Oceanic Bank, who was looking to increase their market share. We received support from Pacific Rise, which is a program funded by the Australian government, to explore opportunities in the Solomon Islands, and we identified Coconut Pacific as a social enterprise that was helping village-level enterprises to set up virgin coconut oil extraction plants in order to produce virgin coconut oil and sell it ultimately for export. Now, what we did under our fund was we went to the bank and said, would you be interested in financing these businesses? They said, well, maybe, but there's some risk involved. We haven't done this before. And so we said, we'll come in with a 50% guarantee and share with you any risk in that portfolio. That was enough to get the bank on board. And the $50,000 of funding provided was enough to give the bank confidence to do $125,000 worth of loans. So that was 5 units of $25,000, 5 village level processing units. Those units generated income and employment for 72 people, and with an average household size of 5, positively impacted 360 lives in the community. Now, we obviously can't do all of this work alone. Our various development partners help fund our work on the ground, scoping opportunities, identifying partners, and engaging with them to deliver the product and monitor and report back. We're able to contain our costs through generous pro bono audit and legal support. And DFAT has funded our first lost capital pool along with our initial investor Cages. So I express my deep appreciation to all of our partners who enable us to do what we do, as well as our emerging partners out there in the field that we're working with. So what will all of this achieve? Well, our goal is to create at least 4 in-country partnerships with local lenders that will leverage $2 million in debt financing. That financing will fund at least 50 SMEs that will generate income for 1,000 households, positively impacting 5,000 low-income people through improved incomes, which supports their journey out of poverty. Along the way, through an intentional focus on gender lens investing, we're looking to improve gender equity and establish an evidence base for sustainable gender lens investing in the Asia Pacific. All of this while generating a cash equivalent return to investors in the fund. Now, we're delighted that DFAT has contributed and fully funded our first loss tranche. And so we're now seeking investment capital of $800,000 towards this initiative, as well as grant funding of $200,000 to support the activities on the ground. We have a more detailed information memorandum, and I would be happy to share that with anybody. If you'd like to reach out to me, the details are on the screen. And of course, I'm very happy to take any questions either now or during the panel discussion that's coming up shortly. So thank you for that, and I'll hand back to you, Lillian.
Thank you so much, Shane. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I will have questions for the panelists. And I just would like to remind everybody to please put their questions in the chat, and I will ask the questions as we go. One of the things that I just wanted to share and of my involvement with Aiden and this wonderful fund is the quote by Robert Swan, the great kind of adventurer, explorer, who said, "The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it." And what I love about the panelists and this project that I'm about to introduce is the breadth of organisations and people represented. That it's not people saying it's the government's problem to solve it, it's the philanthropists' problems to solve it, or it's the investment community's problem to solve it. It really is a whole of community and whole of Australian approach to solving some of our most important problems. And so I just wanted to say what a remarkable effort it is to bring people together around a topic like this. So we have Gemma Salteri, a philanthropic investor, and she's the Executive Director of the Cages Foundation. We have Stephanie Kimber, Assistant Director, Innovation Exchange from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And we've got Yannick Milev, the CEO of the Chamron Microfinance Organisation. I think I'm going to start with you, Gemma. I'd love you to answer the question or discuss how it is that a philanthropic organisation gets its head around impact investing, and what was your decision making around making this investment?
I think you just jump in. I can only speak from my experience, but when we first started impact investing, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, we had no experience. But we decided it made sense to us philosophically and intuitively. So we learnt from others and we just started making investments. And I think until you start making investments, it's really hard to learn. And so my advice would be to initially to just give it a go. The decision to invest in this fund was an easy one based on our experience with Good Return. We've been recycling a no interest $100,000 loan with Good Return for about 3 or 4 years now, and the impact that keeps delivering, the social impact, is extraordinary. And so when Shane called and said, we're launching this fund, would you mind just rolling over again? It was an easy decision because of the extraordinary social impact we know that Good Return can deliver.
Thank you. Stephanie, my next question is for you. What's the role of government in impact investing, and what specifically is the role that DFAT has played? And to add on to that, what more could government be doing to support the impact investing ecosystem and to support funds like Good Return?
All right, how long do I have? Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, and I also took a quick squiz at the attendees and saw some familiar names, so that was really nice to see people and be reconnected. So I think broadly the role for government is to catalyse and to market signal. So DFAT only has the ability to provide grants at this stage. So we are always looking for ways to make that grant money go further. And what Gemma said about recycling that money, we see great opportunity in impact investing to use our grant. You know, hopefully the whole guarantee doesn't get called in and we don't lose all of that, but we see our investment in this fund particularly as remaining, and when they raise future funds, which I'm sure they will, they'll still have our first loss there to entice investors in. So, I mean, we've just launched a new aid and development strategy, Partnerships for Recovery, and one of the key pillars under that is economic recovery. And we all know that the development program, the aid program, has been getting smaller, and even globally, it's such a small amount of the money that we need to reach the SDGs and to save the planet, as you say, Lillian. So we recognise that we need to work together with different sources of capital. There's just no way we can do it together on our own. Super quickly, DFAT works particularly in 3 sort of ways. We're working with partner countries to improve the regulation and policy environment. We're also doing a lot of investment in investment readiness and that sort of like entrepreneurial ecosystem support and pipeline development, which is often cited as one reason that investors don't go to emerging markets. They don't think there's any investable opportunities there. And then we also are doing blended finance, which is what we would call this. You know, we've got, I guess the biggest thing in the DFAT landscape in impact investing at the moment is the newly launched Emerging Market Impact Investment Fund, which is the first time, and it's taken about 3 years of pain, the first time that DFAT is having its own fund. It's a fund of funds where our aid, it can only take aid money at this stage. It's a $40 million fund, and it's going to be looking to signal to first-time fund managers, emerging market-focused fund managers in the region, and we'll be hoping to make its first investments. It'll probably take first loss positions in these sort of funds. Shane also mentioned PackRise, which is an awesome program that's working in the Pacific to sort of subsidize the quite expensive operation for intermediaries to go into the Pacific and find opportunities and get them investment ready. We support a whole heap of other things. One thing I just wanted to quickly outline was My Frontier Brokers program, which Good Return is a part of. So you've heard a lot about the Good Return work. We're also supporting, so we use our grant money to subsidize the design and structuring of new investment vehicles or activities. So I think that's the critical role for government, is to support new and innovative vehicles, because I don't think we just can't expect private capital to go to where we need it to be. So I'll stop there. I could go for ages.
That's an interesting point, that we can't expect private capital to go where we need it to be, unfortunately. So I'm just going to take this opportunity to do a shameless plug for a bit of research that I know Impact Investing Australia is wanting to do, which is to create a blueprint for gender lens investing, so that Australia's been wonderful in supporting American initiatives and American research into that area, but it would be great for us to have our own blueprint on how to better do that here in Australia. So yeah, that's possibly another role where, you know, the more educated an investor group is, the more likely it is to kind of move capital into that area. Yannick, welcome to this session, and I'd love to turn to you for a moment to explain a little bit about what it is that your organisation does and what the benefit of a fund like Good Returns Impact Investment Fund, you know, what does it do for your organisation and how important is it?
Okay, yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so we have a long-standing partnership with Good Return that's taken us on many different paths of collaboration together, to supporting the financial literacy initiatives that we have, to supporting our staff through an e-learning platform, and lots of different initiatives that Shane mentioned that we've been part of. So we were very happy to hear about this new program that they were launching, which has 3 components, which we're taking part to, which are this guarantee fund, the capacity building to develop the SME financing within our organization, and then ensuring that all this happens with an adapted gender lens. So just maybe to give you a little bit of background about Chamron, the MFI that I'm CEO of, and how this all makes sense in that regard. So our focus initially is to work with low-income families for productive uses. So basically, we give small loans to help these families to develop income-generating activities. And so we cover around 40,000 families around 16 provinces in Cambodia today. We were initially founded by a French NGO back about 15 years ago, and then we were just bought out by some impact social investors from Japan about 2 years ago. And so this work of giving small uncollateralized loans to low-income families has always been our focus. Adding to that work, the work on financial literacy and ensuring that these families access loans in a responsible manner, and that doesn't over-indebt them, that they take it understanding the risks in taking loans. And this is something that in Cambodia is particularly important because of the saturated microfinance sector and the fact that there is a lot of concern about over-indebtedness here. So the work that we do in giving access to these small loans by helping them do so responsibly and making sure the loans are adapted is work that we'll continue doing, and that has even more relevance in the current context of people having lost money from the remittances from garment sector, tourism, and other kind of pillars of the Cambodian economy that have been affected. So in that process, our idea was to expand that work to, I'm just going to explain to you, but there's a thought process that led us to this program. I'll try to be succinct, to try to understand the theory of change and how this program really makes sense. So the idea was to go deeper into rural areas to find ways to finance families that were more isolated, that were less had less access to adapted financial services. So in that process of doing so, we thought, well, why don't we try to work with the actors and the networks that are already present in rural areas, and try to piggyback some of these platforms there for efficiencies in the way that we're going to deliver these services, promote the services, promote the trainings, do collections of loans, etc. And as we did so, one of the main platforms that we thought of were agricultural cooperatives. And so we thought, there's around 1,200 cooperatives agricultural cooperatives in Cambodia who have very varied roles in terms of how they support different value chains. And and as we were talking to these cooperatives, we realized that actually those cooperatives themselves had issues accessing financing. And the fact that these cooperatives had themselves issues in accessing financing actually created a kind of a barrier for the farmers and the families themselves that we wanted to finance in terms of their accessing to markets, and accessing to markets that were, first of all, fair in terms of pricing, in terms of timeliness of payments, and also sustainable, meaning that they could have access to these platforms to sell their goods in a way that was just not season by season. And so we started looking into, well, okay, how can we maybe actually do some upstream financing of these agribusinesses while at the same time supporting the families, but in a way kind of building that ecosystem. And the more we delved into that, the more we realized that the agricultural sector, the value chains are very underdeveloped, understructured, and that the whole market and value chain, actually one of the main reasons that it's underdeveloped is because of access to financing. And the main barriers, and I think Shane touched a bit on that, these agribusinesses aren't able to access financing is essentially primarily because of collateral requirements. And those collateral requirements in Cambodia are generally to provide a collateral that has a value of 150% or 200% of the loan they're asking. So it's extremely conservative. And what a lot of these agribusinesses do is get individuals like the chairman of the cooperative to provide his own land, for example, which is a very messy system, which creates a lot of tension in governance, and which for many ACs, they just don't have access to that option. Of course, there's also the problem of their being investment ready. If you try to get a balance sheet from a cooperative, you're going to spend a lot of time doing that. So a lot of banks and financial institutions just kind of steer away from that, notwithstanding, of course, risk linked to climate change and other weather events that could affect agricultural production. So all that put together, we said, well, we want to work with these guys. The end story is that as we work with these different actors of the value chain, we are helping those families which we initially intended to support. That the benefit goes to them in the end because they are the ones who get access to those markets. And so we started exploring different ways in which we could, first of all, develop our SME lending capacity, but also share risk among different stakeholders. And so currently in Chamron, 80% of our borrowers are women. So we had always the idea to try to ensure that lending to women is not, it doesn't mean you have a gender focus. So we wanted to actually formalize that and build our expertise and our framework in terms of how to lend to women with a stronger gender framework. And so when Shane and the Good Return team talked to me about the program, the three components: first, to share some risk in terms of priority sectors. Secondly, to build our capacity in terms of SME lending. And thirdly, to have some support in terms of framing the gender lens approach. All those were completely aligned to what we were going to do and what we thought would help to ensure that those families in the end had access to stronger revenues and more sustainable revenues.
Thank you, Yannick. And just a reminder to all of the attendees who are on there, if you've got some questions, please do put them in the chat and I'll be sure to ask the panelists. But I'm going to return to you, Shane. Speaking of good returns, a lot of words that we hear again and again in 2020. Unprecedented is one of them. As we know, we all look forward to more precedented as opposed to unprecedented times. Catalytic is another one of the words that we keep hearing in 2020. In what way can your fund be described as catalytic? How do you use that word in relation to what it is that you're doing?
Well, I think there's a few elements to that, Lillian. The first is that what our fund is doing is we're not directly investing from Australia in businesses overseas. We see it as our role to help stimulate local financing. And so what we do is we help local lenders to grow a new product if necessary, to establish a portfolio of loans through that product, and gain confidence in the risk levels of that portfolio. And eventually, our hope is that they are willing to continue extending loans without the need for our guarantees. And Yannick gave the example that existing lenders in this space are requiring 150, 200% the value of the loan in collateral, which is ridiculous. And so what we're looking to do is build confidence in, I guess, build expertise in lending, first of all, so that the loans are successful and are successfully repaid, that they generate social benefit, but that they also perform for the lender. And that way the lender is able to continue to deliver on that portfolio long after the guarantee has been withdrawn. Secondly, it's catalytic in the sense of introducing the concepts of gender lens investing to some of our partners. They're at various stages of awareness and familiarity with these approaches, but helping them think through those processes, develop the tools, test it out, validate it, in terms of its effectiveness for them, report to their board, get feedback from their governance and investors on the benefits of that concept. So, and then we hope that our partners will actually it will serve as a role model to other lenders out there in the sector, that we can put them on a stage and say, look at what these guys are doing, you could be doing the same. And the third sense in which it's catalytic, I think, is through the use of blended capital. So we have the first loss tranche, which Stephanie spoke to, which is being used to catalyse or crowd in private sector investment capital that will enable us to expand the reach of the fund ultimately.
I think we've seen in Australia, it's been the family offices and the high net worths who've kind of led the way on impact investing. And Gemma, this is, I'm just putting you on notice that this is a question for you. Representing a PAF, why is it that PAFs and foundations whose very existence is to drive specific missions, usually in the social and environmental impact spaces, why do you think some of them have been slow to consider investing corpus in a way that so clearly aligns with their philanthropic values?
First of all, I think we're seeing an increase in foundations and PAFs investing in impact investing, and I think it's probably hasn't grown as quickly as we'd all like to see, but I do think there is growth, and I think we'll continue to see growth. I think there are a few areas. I think there's quite a famous investing continuum where you go from grant money to traditional investment, and impact investing kind of sits somewhere along that continuum. I think the expectation of people seeking capital is that foundations are more likely to invest because it's mission aligned and program aligned. But the closer you get towards that grant end of the spectrum, the more competitive and more compelling your social or environmental returns have to be, because you're competing with monies that are directly driving social impact. So when you're competing with grant money, while the financial return isn't necessarily important, or certainly not as important, what is important is really clear, measurable social or environmental impacts. And I don't think there hasn't been a lot, and we're getting much better at it, but there's not a lot of product available that can clearly articulate social and or environmental return. And one of the reasons why this fund is so compelling is that those social returns are so clearly articulated, and impact investment makes so much sense in this scenario because this is the core skill set of Good Return, and it makes a lot of sense of what their core mission is in driving financial literacy and driving access to capital in developing markets. I think the sector like the closer you get to kind of the traditional impact investment end, where you're driving high financial return with a secondary benefit of social or environmental return, I think you've seen that market grow more quickly because it's much more aligned to what the corpus is traditionally supposed to do, which is deliver a financial return so you can grant more money. So I think like that's one that not necessarily confusion, but that competing for funds is one of the barriers. I don't think there's an expertise in the philanthropic sector around how to do impact investing, how to measure the social impact or the environmental impact. I also think there's confusion around fiduciary duty, and sometimes that's kind of held up as, oh, we can't invest in that because it's not our fiduciary duty. And then you'll say, what is your fiduciary duty? Oh, I don't know, but I can't do it. So I think there's a fear of the unknown. So I think there's quite a few barriers that have stopped PAFs investing their corpus, and some of the legislative framework which is starting to shift under PAF guidelines or has shifted, but there needs to be growing awareness of what you actually can and can't do.
Great, thanks. That's a very comprehensive answer, Gemma. And hopefully with the, I'm sure most of you on this call saw that interesting challenge to a superannuation fund about not taking into account the risk of climate change. I wonder, or, you know, climate risk has to now, well, in at least one case, be considered by a board of directors. It'll be an interesting space to follow. A question for you, Stephanie, around governments around the world and where Australia sits in terms of best practice and what you've seen, or how Australia compares to other players, whether it's the US, the UK, other players who are taking an impact investing or an impact first approach to development.
Yeah, look, I think in many ways of measuring how well we're doing, we are in amongst the leaders. I think we can particularly say that we are leaders in gender lens investing, in applying a broad lens across everything that we do and everything that we support. That's why Good Return was successful in our Frontier Brokers tender. So we are definitely up there with the most pushy donors around gender. Canada probably outstrips us in their feminist foreign policy, but they have way more money than we do, but they have been very slow in getting that towards non-grant instruments. They're doing a lot of granting, which I think is super valuable and really needed. And I think, you know, where the size of our development program has, you know, continues to be a constraint to how much we can do. I think we are one of the only donors in Asia Pacific that focuses on this enabling environment, the entrepreneurial ecosystem. We actively fund the support and capacity building of incubators and accelerators and financial intermediaries. And that is a really critical role for government, for foundations, for other organizations that have ready access to grant funding, because investors typically don't want to be spending money on investment readiness. They may be willing to spend some money on technical assistance to their portfolio once it's up and running, but nobody wants to pay for the incubator or accelerator program that is contributing to the pipeline of investable opportunities. So like USAID is doing a lot of very similar things. They have this very large, everything they do is much bigger than us in every way, but we're very aligned along this support to supporting financial intermediaries, helping technical assistance for that very early investment readiness. You know, one of our projects, Biduk, which is in the Frontier Broker family, works in Jakarta. They provide very bespoke loan products to women and other impact-focused entrepreneurs. You know, and the people they're working with, they don't have accounts in a software. They maybe have a box full of receipts. You know, there's a large gap between where an entrepreneur might be delivering some impact to having them ready to even take on a loan or work with a financial institution like a bank, and a huge gap to where they would be to be interesting to a venture capital fund. I don't necessarily think venture capital is very useful for impact in emerging markets, not when you're looking to try and support the sort of steady growth businesses that are delivering a lot of impact. I think supporting businesses with a rapid, that sort of hockey stick growth is not very useful for the types of businesses that we see and interact with.
Thank you, Steph. Shane, a couple of questions for you I'm going to ask in a row. One is, does Good Return make sure the clients you're working with are taking account of climate risk and the need for climate adaptation in their businesses? First question. And the second question, what do you believe the impact of the current low interest rate environment might be on investor appetite, given that your, the cash rate of return is what is the rate that investors will be receiving? So two slightly different questions, one on climate risk and I guess the other one on cash rates.
Sure. Starting with the climate risk one, it's a good question. You know, it's difficult when you're working with small businesses to engage intensively around topics such as environmental sustainability and climate adaptation within their business, because the size of the investment, it's very hard to justify a lot of technical assistance to support them. And so one way we've got around that problem is with each of our partners focusing our support on a particular agricultural value chain and one or more value chains. And what that enables us to do then is to get to know that value chain really well, the different actors in the value chain, what their financing needs are, but also what the potential environmental impacts of their current activities are, and also how, you know, climate adaptation might require changes to that value chain over time. So while it may not be viable for us to do that on a business by business basis, it is viable for us to do that and investigate that on a value chain basis. And then we can take that lens and talk to our partners about financing that value chain and what sort of measures they will incorporate into their lending processes to manage that risk. On the second question about the cash rate of return, it is an interesting one. We've watched cash rates go down, even this week, historic lows, 0.1%. And there's some negative impact, I would say. If term deposits were paying 6 or 7%, then we'd be able to pay 6 or 7% to investors, and our fund would look a lot more attractive. So that's unfortunate on one level. On another level, however, right now, PAFs are sitting on a lot of cash, and a lot of investors are sitting on a lot of cash, even though it's not giving them a return. It's quite a conservative investment climate.
I need to interrupt you, Shane, to say that this was 100% not a Dorothy Dixer question. This genuinely came because Shane and I had discussed this yesterday. This is absolutely coming from
We
you.
did. We had a chat about this, and so yes, while the low interest rates, in theory, could damage our prospects of raising funds, on the other hand, the fact that so many PAFs and foundations are sitting on a lot of cash that's just earning a cash rate in the bank makes this an easier proposition for them, because you can earn that same rate by investing in this fund and get all the social return which your foundation was set up to generate in the first place.
Great, thanks, Shane. Another question for you, Yannick, around the role of international impact investment funds. What do you see the role of international funds as opposed to local organisations or seeking funding more locally? Could you talk to that, please?
Yeah, so in our particular case, most of the debt investors, so senior debt, essentially, some subordinated debt, and then now we're trying to build more on the guarantee side, are coming from international impact investors. So what we are trying to diversify our fundraising to local banks, for example, so we can get local currency funding and potentially cheaper rates. But that's actually not ending up playing out very well on that side. So we're getting a lot more interest from international impact investors than we actually from local investors in Cambodia. And what we find with the investors in Cambodia, so typically the banks, is actually, kind of replicating the problem that we talked about and the reason, why we finance the SMEs, that they are extremely, not ready to engage in partnerships without taking any risk. And so we find that the risk appetite for the international investors is higher, and allows, and even, without there being significant risk, to be honest, from what I can see from me running this business, they are on paper taking more risk, but the ways that local investors are analyzing risk is it's a huge barrier for businesses like mine, and then everything downscale to access. So I don't know if that answers the question. But.
Do you see them as competing?
Yeah, to some extent, but I think at this point there's enough space for, and namely related to this question of risk appetite. So the markets that local investors and sectors that they're focusing on, and the ones that international investors are focusing on, targeting the impact space, I don't see much overlap. There's a little bit, but not much. If those local investors, increase their risk appetite, then there will be a lot more overlap, and it may make it a bit more difficult for international investors to find, opportunities, namely from a pricing perspective, because a lot of the business here are extremely price sensitive, so a lot of local banks here, for example, who are getting financing from Japan or Korea, are getting extremely cheap funds and can on lend at lower rates. So there could be a pricing issue, but so far, because of this question of risk appetite, I don't see too much overlap.
Thank you. And I'm going to have one final question, unless anyone is putting more questions in the chat, and that's going to be for Shane, but please, anyone on the panel, jump in. In what sense is the fund impact first? And if you could just talk to that a little bit. There are some people on the call who are very, very sophisticated in the world of impact investing, and others who I know are sort of at the beginning of their journey to impact. The way I always talk about impact is that it's not necessarily, and well, it's not at all an asset class, it's more a lens through which you do your investing. Some people do impact first, some people do finance first. People take different approaches, and everybody has their own way of doing things along their journey to impact. Shane, could you talk to that impact first element of the fund?
Sure, Lillian. I think in its essence, it comes back to the fact that we started with the problem and then looked for a way to finance that problem. And while that might sound really obvious, I think you'll find for a lot of impact investment funds, that's not the way they start. They start with a bucket of money and then work out, well, how can I make this money do some good? They go looking for a problem. I guess we have the advantages in that we are an international development agency, and we're at the coalface with our partners, such as Chamron. I'm saluting you, Yannick, and your team by wearing your uniform today. And so through practical experience on the ground, we know what's needed, and we designed this financing solution in order to respond to that need. The nature of the guarantees is that you don't receive the same level of financial return as you would if you were making direct loans into businesses, for which you can charge higher rates and therefore offer greater returns back to your investors. But our impact goal is not only to get funding to those businesses, it's actually to stimulate local finance. Now, in addition to the financing side, there's also the technical support that we offer in order to maximize the social impact. So together with our technical partners at Palladium, we conduct a diagnostic and help them develop their products. We've talked about the gender lens investment side. So there's a lot more to it than just the provision of finance that goes on in order to maximize the impact. So while there's a lower financial return, there's a very clear and deliberate social return that you get from the investment.
And while we're just in the granular, what's the average term, Shane, of the loan that you'll make, and how can an investor exit after 3 years?
So the guarantee agreements that we form with partners typically start, they vary, but usually about 3 years in duration. And so for the initial guarantees that we place that have a 3-year life cycle, the commitment of those funds will be released after 3 years. As we bring on more partners over the next 2 years, those 3-year agreements will be staggered. And so the overall fund has a life cycle of 5 years, but some of the funds will be available for release after approximately 3 years. And so that means that some investors, if they wish, will be able to withdraw their funds earlier than the 5-year commitment period.
And of the 800,000, how much has been secured? And are you finding that it's coming from individuals or foundations?
So it's a combination. We've already raised, so towards our overall target of $1 million, we've got just over a third, including the DFAT first loss component. And it's a combination of individuals and foundations. And we think it can appeal to both, in particular PAFs and foundations that are sitting on corpus that's there to generate impact. This presents a low risk opportunity. And as I said, an alternative to cash to them in their portfolio.
Okay, thank you for that, Shane. I might hand back to Mark if he's ready to come back. There he is.
Yes, I'm ready. And wow, that was fantastic. Look, I'm someone in my life, I mainly just focus on granting, but I learned a lot today, and I think I'll be putting an inquiry to learn a little bit more. Lillian, thank you very much for chairing today. You made it look easy. It's not. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the panel. You've made us all a lot wiser about impact investing today. And Shane, all the very best for the launch of the fund. The recording from today will be available on the Aiden website within a couple of days. You do all have Google machines, so feel free to search out any of today's presenters if you wish to follow up the conversation. Failing that, contact Julie Rosenberg via our website. Our next webinar, it's next Tuesday, 10th of November at 4:30 p.m. It's titled Global Problems, Local Solutions, Connecting with Leaders Working in Refugee Settings. That panel will be hosted by Sophie Neal, who these days is at Human Rights Watch Australia. The Australian International Development Network, it's all about more and better giving. Don't be a stranger. If you want to give more, if you want to give better, if you want to invest better internationally, or if you're on the doing side, contact us. We're eager for your assistance, for your resources and your ideas. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. For Melbourneites, it's a 6 donut day. And for the rest of Australia, very soon, we look forward to welcoming you back in person to our fine and safe state. Good afternoon, everybody.